Hello everyone, this is Dripta. Welcome to lecture 27 of week 6 and the title of today's lecture is From Transformation to GB Theory. So, in today's class we will be talking about the following topics: C selection and S selection, transformational rules, then we will talk about theta theory and the projection principle and extended projection principle. Finally, we will talk about the importance of GB theory. So, we have already learnt about a number of concepts in syntax which are still valid and important for us. So, let us have a very quick recap of the topics that we have covered. So, if you remember, we started the course with the idea of grammaticality and acceptability, which is also quite important for us in syntax. I hope you understood that. So, we also learnt about adequacies, 3 different types of adequacies if you remember. We learnt about the poverty of stimulus questions and the idea of universal grammar. We briefly talked about the difference between principles and parameters. Then we also learnt about certain units of syntactic analysis, for examples XPs, different types of phrases, and we talked about the phrase structure rules or PSRs. We also learnt about the concept of predicate and argument and the idea of subcategorization as well. All these concepts will be important for us while we will be doing syntax. Today initially I will be talking about 2 different types of selections which are related to the idea of subcategorization. So, what are the 2 different types? One is C selection, the other is S selection. So, C selection is basically syntactic in nature, while we are saying C, it is basically related to constituent and it is related to subcategorization. You have already learnt about subcategorization. And there is another type of selection which is S selection, which is semantic in nature. So, when we say that verbs select subjects and complements based on semantic properties, then we are talking about S selection. I am sure you can recall the ideas that we discussed previously. We talked about how verbs take subjects and complements. Now, we are saying verbs select subjects and complements, and how do they select and why do they select? Because of certain semantic properties. So, we will elaborate this in today's class itself, but now it is important for us to understand that there is a difference between these 2 types of selections. So, now we can say that in order to create a well formed sentence, we need structural constraints of phrase structure rules and we also need C selection and S selection. Today we will be learning about something called transformation rules. I am sure some of you already know about transformation rules and certain examples that we will be discussing today. We talked about similar examples for something else. I hope you will remember them. So, let us read sentences A and B. The cat is eating. Is the cat eating? So, if I ask at this point what is happening here, you can say that this is an example of yes no question. So, the answer will be either yes or no. So, it is a yes no question. But what is happening here in relation to the structures? Now, you have the notion of deep structure and surface structure in your mind. You remember we talked about the relationship between deep structure and surface structure and also discussed syntactic ambiguities. So, we are coming back to the ideas of deep and surface structure, which can be actually a clue for the puzzle. So, you can say that there are certain structural differences here. So, instead of saying the cat is eating, you are saying is the cat eating. So, there are some structural changes or changes of some positions. but we are making a very important claim at this point. Structural differences lead to meaning differences. So, we have been talking about structure for last few classes, but now it is also important for us to pay some attention to the meaning component. We can say for the previous examples A and B that there is a declarative sentence at the deep structure, and the relationship between a declarative sentence and yes no question is to allow the phrase structure principle to manipulate the underlying structure of the declarative sentence. So, I am asking you to please pay attention to this part, manipulate this underlying structure of the declarative sentence. So, you understand that the statement is the declarative sentence and we are manipulating the underlying structure. How? Because there is some kind of changes happening, some kind of structural changes happening which is related to the semantic difference as well. Let us learn about something called a transformational rule. What is the transformational rule for the example sentences here? A transformational rule moves the auxiliary to the front before the subject. Is the cat eating? So, is the auxiliary, we are moving is before the subject, the cat, and this movement is basically, so you are familiar with this idea of movement. Previously we talked about it as a test for constituency and also as a syntactic phenomena. So, we are coming back to the idea of movement and we are saying that the transformational rule for these sentences are actually saying that we are moving the auxiliary to the front, and the moved element is found in the surface structure. So, for the second sentence, sentence B, you can see that you can identify the moved element in a different position. So, in the surface structure you find a moved element, but in deep structure the underlying structure, the meaning component, it is something different. The underlying structure is basically different. So, we can say that PS rules implement the X bar schema to generate the basic structure. So, now you know that there is something called PS rules, the phrase structure rules. If you remember the rules that we discussed previously, and you also remember the schema of X bar that we discussed previously. So, the rules and the schema are helping to generate the basic structure, and move applies to the basic structure to produce the derived structure. So, derived structure is another important point at this moment when we are discussing the transformational rules. So, the derived structure is basically the when the movement takes place and then you get something else. So, it is important for us to note that move is a formal device and move is also called a transformational rule in traditional approaches of sentence relatedness. So, remember we talked about the certain operations called merge and move when we started talking about syntax. So, this is the same kind of move that we are referring to, and we say that we do say that move is a formal device, but a transformational rule is basically an approach which was taken earlier than the current approach that we will be discussing in today's class, and it is related to the sentence relatedness. So, now we can say that we can generate sentences with the help of phrase structure rules. Words and phrases are assembled following the X bar schema and they are constrained by C selection and S selection to satisfy lexical requirements. So, if you pay attention to the last one, there are two components, right. The first two are absolutely okay for us. We know that what are PSRs and we know what is X bar schema, but why we are saying that they are constrained by C selection and S selection to satisfy lexical requirements. So, at this point I will ask you to think about the argument structure that we discussed previously. So, there are certain lexical requirements, right. So, if we say that C selection and S selection are related to the subcategorization frame, then we can say that they are constrained by C selection and S selection to satisfy lexical requirements. So, there are specific requirements for specific predicates, right. And we can think about a number of examples while talking about transformational rules. We already talked about the sentences where we are moving an auxiliary to the front in order to create yes no question. There are some more examples. I am asking you to think about the structures of these sentences, the pairs. So, the first the example set is from active and passive constructions. The cat ate a cheese was eaten by the cat. So, there is something happening, right. We can explain the same phenomena in terms of transformational rules. If we think about their sentences, for example, there is a cat in your house and a cat is in your house, we can also explain this phenomena with the help of transformational rules. And PP preposing, prepositional phrase preposing. Let us read this example. The cat ate an apple with the fork. With the fork, the cat ate an apple. So, we are preposing the prepositional phrase. So, all these examples are possible to explain with the help of transformational rules. So, we will come back to subcategorization again and we will see why we are coming back to it. So, we know that native speakers have the knowledge of sub-classification of verbs based on their argument structures. I hope you remember what the argument structures are, because we talked about the idea of transitivity, if you remember, and different predicates can take different arguments, the number of arguments are different. This is something that we had discussed earlier. So, now we are saying that this sub-classification of verbs based on the argument structure is also there in our knowledge of language. It is a part of our knowledge of language, right. So, when children acquire a language, it means that the children acquire both the categories and subcategories. It is a part of the knowledge of language for a child. So, the knowledge of the distinction between complements and adjuncts is also there. I am also reminding you the difference between complements and adjuncts that we discussed. One is optional and the other is not optional, right, if you remember. So, all these are parts of our knowledge of language that we have to remember. And today we will be talking about a different kind of theory, which is related to the argument structure, but we are emphasizing more on the meaning component. So, I am asking you to consider the verb kill here and comment on the argument structure of the verb kill. So, for example, if I say the cat killed the rat, you can say that the verb kill takes two NPs, two arguments, and what is interesting to notice here is that the two NPs are not having similar kind of semantic relationship with the verb. Yes, the verb is taking two NPs, but these are different in terms of semantic relationships, right. So, how do we capture that theoretically? So, we in the theory of argument structure, subcategorization, we can of course talk about the number of XPs and the kind of XPs that they can take, the predicates can take, but there is a gap because we do not know how to account for the semantic relationships with the verb. So, we need a change in the theory, we need something else, right. So, if you consider the example that I have just given, we can say that the subject position NP is the agent of the activity of killing. So, the cat is basically killing the rat. So, there is an agent, and rat is the direct object. You understood from the structure that it is the direct object, right. it expresses the patient of the activity. So, this is more like a script of a play where different actors are involved and they have different roles. So, the NPs have different roles and these roles are theoretically known as the theta roles. So, when we talk about, when we explain subcategorization in terms of meaning component now, we will be saying that predicates have a thematic structure. So, it is related to the theta roles only. So, predicates have a thematic structure. We can also say that the verb theta marks its arguments. So, when we are saying the verb theta marks its arguments, please keep in mind that we are emphasizing the meaning component. So, the verb is theta marking arguments only when we are talking about the semantic relationship, and this theory is known as theta theory. So, let me talk about the different kind of theta roles that we find in sentences, and when we think about the meaning component of argument structure, we do need them. So, let us go through the definitions. So, the first one is the agent. We already talked about agent in terms of the examples discussed previously. Agent is the one who intentionally initiates the action expressed by the predicate. So, this is the basically the subject, right. So, you can explain it differently in terms of meaning. We are saying that this is agent, the role is the role of an agent. Then we will talk about patient, the person or thing undergoing the action expressed by the predicate is the patient. So, in the example we have also seen that the direct object is acting as a or playing the role of an agent, so I am sorry, the patient. Then we are talking about theme. What is a theme? The person or thing moved by the action expressed by the predicate. So, if you have another NP, you can talk about the idea of a theme, but please make a note that we are saying a person or thing moved by the action expressed by the predicate. So, if you think about a 3+ predicate, for example, you can get an example of a theme, verbs like give or put, right. What is an experiencer role? The entity that experiences some psychological state expressed by the predicate. So, we do refer to the role as experiencer role. Then there is beneficiary, an entity that benefits from the action expressed by the predicate. Then we have a goal, an entity towards which the activity expressed by the predicate is directed. Then there is the source role, the entity from which something is moved as a result of the activity expressed by the predicate. And there is location, the place in which the action or state expressed by the predicate is situated. So, now you understand that these various roles will be a very important tool for us if we are considering the meaning component in an argument structure, and you can also take any sentence and try to figure out the roles. When I am saying you can take any sentence, you can always take sentences either in English or in your own language. So, in terms of theta theory, it is very important for us to learn about the theta criteria. So, how are we talking about or how are we defining theta criteria? We can say that each argument is assigned one and only one theta role. This is super important because one argument cannot have more than one theta roles. One argument will have only one theta role. This is very important for our purpose. And similarly, each theta role is assigned to one and only one argument. You cannot have the same theta role assigned to two NPs in a same sentence. So, this is very important for us to remember. So, we have something new to learn again. So, this is the projection principle. What do we mean by the projection principle? It simply says that lexical information is syntactically represented. So, you understood what do we mean by lexical information. You have different types of information related to the lexical items, and it is basically syntactically represented. So, what do we understand from this statement? This is your call to think about it, and along with that I will also introduce you with this idea of extended projection principle or EPP. What does EPP say? It says that regardless of the argument structure, all sentences must have subjects. So, if you think about the different types of argument structures that we have discussed previously, you know that there is something called an external argument. I hope it rings a bell. I did talk about external argument while discussing argument structure and different types of predicates, if you remember. So, the EPP says that whatever the argument structure is, all sentences must have subjects. So, at this I am not elaborating this, but you can ask a question, or you have already thought about the question by yourself. What if there is something called it or there in front of a sentence? So, there are a number of sentences where we do use it or there in the beginning part of a sentence, right. So, at this point you can say that these are known as the expletives or expletive elements. These are required to fill the subject position in certain sentences. So, if you do not have a subject in a sentence, you need to put something in the subject position, then you can put the expletive elements there in order to satisfy the extended projection principle, which says that all sentences must have subjects. So, these are certain structural requirements which we need to learn while we are doing some syntax. So, I have an exercise for you at this point. I hope it is not very difficult, and I am asking you to discuss the argument structures of the following sentences. Let me read out the sentences first. Nita is walking the dogs. The leader has disappointed the crowd immensely. The huge monster frightened the crowd. I have received the book this morning. So, when you talk about or when you discuss the argument structure of the sentences, I think it is also possible for you to comment on the theta roles, right. So, it will be wonderful if you can also figure out the theta roles, the relevant theta roles associated with the sentences. But this is an exercise that you can do it by yourself. So, towards the end part of the lecture, I will introduce you to the work by Chomsky, which is Lectures on Government and Binding, which was done in 1981, and there was a series of lecture called the Pisa lectures, which took place before the book, and those influenced Chomsky to work on the Lectures on Government and Binding. So, this is very important in contemporary syntax, because it is the book actually initiated the birth of government and binding theory, which is a general theory of grammar and a major formal model. But GB theory is also important for another reason. It announced a major departure from the theories in 1950s. So, the transformational rule that we have learned today is basically a rule which Chomsky discussed earlier than this, and which was considered as an important tool for not only syntacticians, but linguists as a whole. But in 1981, when Chomsky introduced the GB theory, it was a milestone because of the simplified operations. So, the Lectures of Government and Binding or GB theory introduced certain modules, and it talked about the fact that lesser number of operations are needed in order to theorize the language. So, we have different modules of GB theory that I will quickly introduce to you, but I will also tell you that we are not going to do all these theories in detail, because there are other NPTEL courses where you can find the details of these theories. So, and of course, if you are interested, you can go through the suggested readings, the key references that we are showing after each and every lecture. So, in GB theory, we do talk about subcategorization that you have already learned, and the X-bar schema or X-bar theory that you have learned. Remember the schema that XP goes to spec and X bar goes to X and YP. So, this is something that the X-bar theory says. Then we also talk about the constraints of movement. So, you have the idea of movement in your mind, right. So, we do talk about certain constraints that movements have. We did not explain the idea of movement in detail, but for the advanced learners, I am sure you have some idea of NP movement or head to head movement or WH movement. So, you can go through them if you are interested. And in today's class, we did talk about theta roles or semantic roles, which are important for us if we want to consider the meaning component. There is another important module of GB theory, which is known as case theory, which is taken from the Karaka theory. Chomsky was influenced by that, and case theory talks about different kind of cases that we will not be discussing in this course. And another theory that we are not discussing is binding theory, which basically talks about the constraints related to certain pronouns. So, we will be coming to the conclusion part, and in today we did talk about the fact that there are two different types of selections called the C selection and S selection, and along with the phrase structure rules we do need these two kinds of selections, and we talked about the fact that structural differences lead to meaning differences. And when we talk about the idea of move, we can say that move applies to basic structure to produce a derived structure. So, we did talk about move as a part of a transformational rule that we discussed today, and we talked about theta theory, and we said that the arguments have different semantic relations with the verb, which is discussed in the theta theory. And we talked about the projection principle, where we said that lexical information is syntactically represented, and the extended projection principle, where it said that all sentences must have subjects. Towards the end, I also introduced you to the idea of GB theory and why this is an important milestone. I briefly mentioned that, and there are certain modules of GB theory. We did not talk about all the modules, but we did mention a few. So, I hope it was useful. These are the key references, and thank you.